Well, good morning and welcome to the MZ Burning Glass studio for this employment situation live analysis. On this June 3rd, 2022, I'm your host, Christopher Laney, and I'm excited and I am joined by two senior labor economists, Ron Hetrick and Rusha Venkudre. Ron and Rusha, welcome to the studio.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
The report just came out, and so I'm excited to have this conversation with you. There's a few things in there that's quite interesting. So, Ron, I'm going to start with you. Can you give me just a couple of that first glance analysis?
Yeah, I think we've been watching things this year. We've been saying that when you're out on the street, you're seeing a lot of help wanted signs. You can tell that the general vibe of things hasn't really changed much. I think this report, pretty much confirms everything that we've been seeing. It's a gain, but these are not the kind of gains that, we really need at this point, knowing that we have, almost 11.5 million job openings. So I'd say it's an okay report. I think we all would like to have seen things a lot better. The other thing I would say really quick is that we saw a pretty decent drop in our labor force last month. We recovered about half of that this month, but we didn't even get back to where we were. So we're still, short of where we were as a labor force back before COVID even became a thing in February of 2020.
Rusha, your initial takeaways, a couple of points maybe that you have.
Sure. So I think, as Ron said, we are still continuing to see job growth, which I think, is great overall, although not anywhere near matching the need that we have. I do think that, we're continuing to see the effects of the pandemic sort of wear down. Teleworking is down a little bit. People who are unemployed due to pandemic has been slowly improving. And we have seen, I think we've heard a lot about sort of how certain industries are suffering. And, information being in the news a whole bunch, but we're seeing job gains there. So I feel like overall, economy is still kind of continuing to move in the direction we've been seeing it.
Rusha, I want to stay with you for just a second, as you brought up, some of those industries that were hard hit, and some have yet to recover from those pre-pandemic employment levels. What are you seeing in some of those industries like manufacturing, which we knew was hard hit, and some of the others?
Yeah. So, manufacturing has continued to have steady growth over the past few months, as has, transportation and warehousing. Construction still been gaining jobs this month. Sort of the big players we saw this month were really in professional and business services had a big increase, as well as leisure and hospitality, which was nice after sort of seeing that January dip.
Ron, retail is one of those industries we're always looking at for a variety of reasons. What are you seeing in the retail industry, and what does it mean to our economy?
Yeah, I've really been looking lately at, especially when you're talking about general merchandise stores. I think we all know these big box names. If you've been watching, inventories have just really exploded in these industries. And the industries, based on research that I've been looking at, they're pretty significantly overhired. So we saw something this month, which was kind of peculiar in that retail had a very big drop, and that drop did occur in general merchandise stores. So there seems to be maybe a relationship there between this, significant inventory bloat and the fact that, we're not seeing those employees retained. I think what's interesting is there's another industry we're comparing this to, which are restaurants, that are significantly underhired versus where they used to be. And we did see a really, really nice gain in restaurants. So is it the case of people, being laid off, or is it the case of people saying, I don't want these jobs versus what's going on in restaurants? I think that part we will never be able to answer, but I think this was an interesting development to see this kind of a bit of a drawdown in retail and this bit of a gain in restaurants that so desperately needs workers right now.
With the retail industry, do you believe that any of the supply chain issues that we're seeing in our economy is playing a role on potentially the drop in retail?
Yeah, absolutely not in a general merchandise level. So retail trade, like I said, general merchandise stores, inventories are at a level historically we've never seen. They're up 20%, even in like the past year or so. So we are starting to hear rumors and things of discounts coming and the like. So that's a lot of indication that these companies have overbought. Now, a lot of these companies were looking at it going, hey, we don't want to be burned again at the end of the year. So we're going to kind of build up our inventories now. But I think we're seeing signs that demand is easing at the same time. But let's make sure that we relate this to employment. And that is in the fact of you have tons and tons of inventory that you now are trying to deal with. And yet you may not be able to move these items. So one way you can help your bottom line a little bit is with a little less headcount. So I think we may be seeing some of this play between inventories and headcount occurring now in these big box retailers.
Rusha, one of I mean, all the headlines we're talking about the housing market, and we're specifically, we're seeing that in a housing market, we're starting to see maybe potentially toppling out in terms of how the cost has gotten. In construction specifically, we saw essentially no change. Do you think that, what does this mean for the construction industry? What does this mean for maybe new builds and housing in the housing market specifically?
I mean, to some extent, like, yes, I think the prices are probably going to start coming down as a result of, the Fed and changing rates. But at the same time, like, there are still a lot of job openings in construction. So, even if things are slowing down, like, even with that, I still think construction is going to continue to keep adding jobs as it has been.
Yeah, I mean, it's also summertime, so if it's really hot, maybe you don't want to be working outside potentially as a
Yeah, but you
challenge.
don't want to be working outside in those Boston winters either. So
That's true. Either way, it works. Ron, we often talk about those that are unengaged from the workforce, and one of the indicators that we saw is that long-term unemployment. While it might have shifted down a little bit, we still have 1.4 million individuals collecting long-term unemployment. Why do you think they're not working when there are so many jobs available?
I think it's actually a very good question. I think we have to start to understand that there are certain aspects. Let's talk about the job openings that we have. Of around this 11.5 million that we've been hovering around, we're dealing with about 7 million that are this face-to-face service level, type of job. So if let's say you've been battling a health issue, a long-term disease, or if you're battling addiction of some kind, like, these are represent a lot of the types of people who've been out of the labor force, not been able to reengage. And I think there may just be a mismatch for, what these people feel that they probably could do versus, what's really available to them. If you're a lower skilled employee, you're going to need to be there, all the hours that they're asking for. You're going to be maybe standing. You're going to have to be face to face with people. You may be lifting boxes. We see so many openings, manufacturing, record level job openings right now, still tremendous amount of job openings in warehouse. And if you're thinking a lot of long-term unemployed people, you really do have to think about those people who may not be in a physical condition to do that type of work.
When you start to, Ron, I'm going to stay with you for a second. When we start to discuss those that are on the sidelines, one of the things that we've been looking at is by education attainment, specifically high school diplomas. Can you talk to us a little bit about the labor force participation, how it's changing among those that maybe have a degree or credential versus those that maybe just have a high school diploma? And why is that
the most important issue I think that we're facing right now in this country? We already know we have a tremendous mismatch versus the types of jobs that we're creating and the types of people that are unemployed and looking for work. So my concern at this point is watching that population of people with a high school diploma or less. And that population is, we're looking at that labor force. That labor force ticked down. And that's not a population we want to see ticking down. 16 to 19-year-olds, the labor force has gone down the past 2 months. We need to see that number heading upward. And we're just not getting those kind of increases in the populations that we know are going to help us, fill these service level sector jobs. We're not seeing the labor force gains that we need to see. And we're running out of unemployed people in those categories to go into those jobs.
That's one of the most common questions I get, especially when we start to break down the numbers of young people. If they're not working, are they in school? Like, what are they necessarily doing?
Yeah, and that's the concern that we have right now. Enrollments dropped pretty dramatically over the past 2 years. So we know that they are really kind of neither in school or neither in the labor force. Over the past couple of decades, we were seeing a population gain in our 16 to 19-year-olds. But with the same time we were seeing the population gain, we were seeing a labor force decline. Sometimes I call it the travel sports phenomenon. I think kids nowadays may be seeing that they're too busy to work. But this is absolutely concerned. There's 11 million 16 to 19-year-olds that are out of the labor force, not working, not looking to work. I mean, this is, historically speaking, these are incredibly high levels. And if we could just get several million of our youth back in the labor force, it would absolutely help to alleviate some of the pressure that we're feeling, certainly in these sub $20 an hour jobs.
When we're talking about the labor force and we start to break it down by essentially age cohort, like young people, Rusha, are we seeing any kind of positive gains, or maybe it's just the same when we look at some of those other demographic groups like prime age working adults, or even that 55 plus cohort which we knew was so dramatically affected coming into the pandemic and even afterwards?
Sorry, I actually need to pull up that data table. Unless Ron just wants to talk. I was not looking at the age. I mean, one of the things that I did notice was when looking at the racial tables, is that unemployment for whites has stayed about the same, but actually ticked up slightly for blacks and Hispanics, and dipped down a little bit for Asians, or actually quite a bit. It went down from about 3.1% to 2.4%. And so, looking at that, I think we're hearing a little bit, we're seeing some of the same stuff that Ron saw in terms of looking at those who are younger and sort of losing them from the labor force a little bit.
Yeah, it's a bit concerning. We obviously don't want we want to see all groups essentially lower in unemployment and specifically labor force participation. Ron, I'll bring it back to you a little bit, and going back to that age cohort. I know we were talking about young people, but are we seeing any of those changes in that 25, 50 to 54, and even that 55 plus age cohort?
Yeah, this is a really important thing as well. So we've been watching labor force participation rates. I keep joking that a country that probably had never even heard the term before, now we're all kind of obsessed with the term labor force participation rate. And the one that we're watching the most is that prime age, 25 to 54 years old. And what's been interesting is it just took a pretty significant tick up. Now you're talking about tenths here, but you have to understand, we were at 83. We had an 83% labor force participation rate prior to the pandemic. We're now at 82.6. So we are almost to a recovered state for our prime age labor force participation rate. Now, here's where the concern is. What am I saying? We're almost to a recovered state in our labor force participation rate for our prime age labor force. Well, we're not feeling any great relief. We're not seeing job openings numbers come down, and yet we're almost back to where we were or what we can expect to get from that population. So what does that tell us? It tells us we're going to have to blow past what we've been doing even in recent history. And that is the part that starts to concern us, because especially when it comes to, prime age men, the propensity there is not to really gain that kind of momentum that we've been seeing. So I think there's good news that we're seeing these returns. I don't want to downplay that, but I am very concerned with the fact that we are seeing things like very low levels of unemployed, only 5.9 million people unemployed. And now we're seeing labor force participation returning. That was the big thing we were waiting for. And yet we're still not seeing jobs being filled, and we're still not seeing significant gains in our payroll employment.
So, Rusha, is this a sign is there any signs in this report that our economy is slowing up, or are we continuing to move on all cylinders?
I mean, I guess I think of this report as saying, things aren't necessarily heating up, but they're not cooling down either, right? And I think we saw something kind of similar with the JOLTS report that just came out, right? So like openings are down a little bit, but still very high. Same with quits rates. Layoffs are actually at an all-time low. So I'm not seeing any clear indication in this data that, good times basically are ending for workers.
Can I also just jump in really quick on that, Chris? We are a country that loves, it's been a long time since we could really publish, layoff announcements. And so recently there's been some high profile layoff announcements from companies that have really big names, in the IT industry. So the question came up, is this a sign? Is this weakness? And our data is showing, no, there's record levels of job openings in IT. They're just not occurring in these companies that you're looking at. And if you look at IT services, they had a really nice gain this past month. And this is despite the fact that the unemployment rate in those occupations is very, very low. So I think there's a lot of indication that there's tremendous strength, even in these ones that you're seeing well publicized. There's still tremendous strength there. And I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact of just because you hear a few layoff announcements isn't the sign that the whole economy is making a turn.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I want to close with this, Rusha. A couple of points just to focus on. If you're an employer potentially, or if we're looking at this report and trying to understand the economy, what are maybe 2 or 3 points that you're seeing in this data that we should either be excited about or at least be maybe a little bit concerned about?
I mean, I think excited that, the job growth is still continuing to be there, even if it's slowed a little bit compared to sort of what we've seen previously. But the problem is, I think, from the employer point of view, the growth is not matching anywhere near what the openings are. So I think we're still in for some tough times on the employer side, which, on the other hand means good for the employees.
Ron, same question to you. Things that you're excited about when you look at this report, and maybe things that you're like, these are potentially things to look at for concern going forward.
I wish I had more things to be excited about. I would say what I'm concerned about is we are seeing really low occupational unemployment rates. If you look into the depths of this report, even things like production occupations, you're talking less than a 4% unemployment rate there. Yet manufacturing with almost 1 million job openings, in the olden days, when we were talking back into the 90s or 2000s, we used to look at a healthy economy as one that generated 500,000 jobs a month, 350,000 plus every single month, and was able to sustain really large numbers. And here we sit with this mountain of job openings, and we're generating, what I would call pretty lethargic numbers. We used to consider 350,000 really good, but when you're talking about, trying to fill 11 million job openings, which is a historical high, we need to see gains of like 750,000. We need to see labor force really getting up above. It's not even to where it was prior to COVID, let alone we need to be way past there. Our population, especially above 16, we're higher, and we're just not getting the momentum that we need. And the question is, well, when do we gain that momentum? And we keep waiting every single month, and yet the indications just are showing that we're just not getting there very quickly, or it's going to take a long time.
Ron, Rusha, thank you so much this morning for the conversation. We know that there's a lot going on, and having your analysis is very helpful. For more information on this analysis, you can visit mzbg.com. Thank you for joining us this morning.